Imagine a full-size sedan that does 0 to 60 as quickly as a V12 Ferrari and faster than a Porsche 911. Oh wait, you don't have to because they're everywhere now, and we owe it all to this car, the Mercedes-Benz 300 SEL 6.3. While they are part of the product lines of countless manufacturers today, cars like this were not the sort of thing that any manufacturer had even conceived of conceiving of back then, let alone built. Indeed, this car only came about because a slightly crazy Mercedes engineer built it himself after hours from parts he managed to dig up around the factory, and it only ended up in production because his boss heard it drive by his open office window late one night and demanded to know what it was. And although it was an S-Class Mercedes, they then took it racing, and it ended up being surprisingly good at that too. This car almost didn't happen. In fact, the member of the Daimler-Benz board responsible for sales said that the car was too dangerous to sell to the public, and that perhaps 50 examples could be built if they went ahead. But he was overruled, and more than 6,500 were made, more than the six-cylinder version of the car that it was based on, in fact. Although they didn't know it at the time, Mercedes engineers had just invented an entirely new genre of car, one which enthusiasts continue to enjoy today, the big sedan that has so much power that it's as quick as sports cars from Porsche and Ferrari. By the mid-60s, Mercedes-Benz had a bit of an image problem. BMW had their recently introduced Neue Klasse cars which combined handsome packaging and athleticism in a fresh and exciting car. That emboldened them to run an ad in Germany asking buyers whether they would rather buy a car from a company that was known for making motorcycles, like BMW, or from a company known for making trucks, like Mercedes. Having left motor racing in 1955, Mercedes' image no longer had the same air of sporting excitement. In Germany, they were seen as high-quality cars for older, conservative folks. Executives, professionals, retirees, and taxi drivers. If there were any enthusiast employees at Mercedes, they sure weren't getting to make the cars they wanted to. Erich Waxenberger was one such employee. He started working for Mercedes-Benz in 1953 in the passenger car testing department, and he tested cars so thoroughly at times that Mercedes-Benz's insurance company requested that he be banned from driving. In 1966, his boss was Rudolf Uhlenhaut, then in charge of passenger car development, but previously the head of Mercedes' racing department during its two most glorious periods of motor racing, the 1930s during the Silver Arrow Grand Prix car era, and again after the war. This latter period was the heyday of the 300 SL and SLR, as well as the two-time Formula One World Championship winning W196. That summer, in 1966, the two of them were meeting with a journalist from one of Germany's car magazines who accused them of getting old because they were surrounded by boring passenger cars. Waxenberger took it to heart and set to work, first doing some designing, and eventually he assembled a small team to build a prototype. When a body shell for a 250 SE coupe accidentally fell off the assembly line during production, Waxenberger was there to catch it, literally and figuratively. Too damaged to be sold on to a customer, the shell was ideal for his development mule, and working with his team after hours and on weekends, they installed the massive 6.3-liter V8 from the absolutely bonkers 600 limousine. Fitted with a 5-speed ZF manual, a clutch from a Mercedes truck, and a fairly rudimentary exhaust system, the car was drivable by mid-1967, and Waxenberger was trying the car out one Friday night after everyone had gone home. Or so he thought. Turns out, his boss Uhlenhaut was still in his office, and on account of the warm weather, the window was open. He heard the car, went to the window, and saw a coupe go by making V8 noises. Mercedes had made only one V8 engine at that point, and that was the 600 engine. The next day, Uhlenhaut called Waxenberger into his office and asked him if he knew anything about it. Waxenberger explained what he had done, and Uhlenhaut of course wanted to drive it immediately. But Waxenberger didn't feel it was ready, and told him he could see it but not drive it the following day. Just to be sure, Waxenberger had a mechanic remove the front brakes overnight. When Uhlenhaut did eventually drive it a few days later, he was thrilled, and asked if he could present it to the board in 2 weeks. The team worked overtime to get the car ready, and aside from the curmudgeonly board member in charge of sales who said it was too fast and dangerous to sell, everyone loved it. The board officially approved the project and allocated it development budget. Along the way, the engineers decided to use the 300 SEL sedan instead, whose air suspension would compensate for the extra weight of the engine, while also providing a more comfortable ride and better traction for putting down the power. The 600 automatic transmission was also used for reasons of comfort and durability. This was, after all, going to be a Mercedes-Benz and would need to meet their strict standards for durability, reliability, and quality. The M100 engine Vauxenberger used for the transplant was something very special indeed. It was originally designed for the 600, a wildly luxurious and sophisticated flagship car that was usually owned by heads of state, industrialists, and celebrities. In 1964, a Cadillac Fleetwood cost $6,300. A Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud cost $16,500. The least expensive 600 cost nearly $23,000. While the top-of-the-line cars from Cadillac and Rolls-Royce used carburetors, push rods, and live rear axles, the 600 didn't just use fuel injection, overhead cams, and independent suspension, but it was self-leveling air suspension and was complemented by a hydraulic system that actuated the power seats, windows, trunk lid, and even the vent on the cowl for cabin ventilation. In every sense, the 600 was an extraordinary car, and they were owned by celebrities like Coco Chanel, David Bowie, Elizabeth Taylor, Elvis Presley, Hugh Hefner, Jack Nicholson, Aristotle Onassis, and every Beatle except Paul McCartney. Heads of state were particularly fond of them too, and not always the nicest guys, including Mao Zedong, every supreme leader of North Korea, Idi Amin, Pol Pot, Saddam Hussein, Mobutu Sese Seko, Nicolae Ceausescu, Robert Mugabe, and many more. But back to the engine. The standard version of the 600 weighed over 5,500 pounds, and the longer Pullman model over 6,000. Despite this, both versions were capable of more than 120 miles an hour. Like all German cars, they were designed to run near their maximum speed for extended periods, and the engine design reflected this. Internal components like connecting rods, pistons, and crankshaft were forged. The crank was also nitrided, while chrome moly piston rings were used. The valves were sodium-filled, the valve seats hardened, and an oil cooler was also provided. If this sounds like race car stuff, it's because it was. Turns out, pushing 3 tons of limousine around at over 100 miles an hour for extended periods works an engine out in much the same way that racing does. For its duty in the 6.3, stiffer valve springs were fitted to the M100 for improved durability at high RPM. It seems that Mercedes engineers expected 6.3 owners to cane their cars, a perfect representation of the typically thorough development of all Mercedes-Benz cars. This extended beyond the engine, of course. A limited slip differential was fitted, together with anti-dive geometry and vented disc brakes at all 4 corners, which were good enough for Road & Track to describe them as so good you have to experience them to appreciate them. In fact, Road & Track was wildly impressed with the whole car. Their tagline for their road test plainly says, "Merely the greatest sedan in the world," describing the handling as better than most sports cars, and the straight-line performance was so good that they decided to take it to the drag strip for a grudge race night. Once there, complete with white wall tires, it beat all comers until it was only finally beaten by a 427 cubic inch Corvette. Even compared to the legendary Mercedes 500e of more than 20 years later, the 6.3 was fast, just half a second behind in both 0 to 60 and the quarter mile. Its 0 to 60 and quarter mile times made it about as fast as a contemporary Porsche 911S or Ferrari 330 GTC, and while this sort of sports car matching performance is routine for fast sedans today, the term performance sedan was effectively meaningless when the 6.3 came out because no one had ever made one before. That it should emerge from a stodgy company like Mercedes-Benz was all the more remarkable. There was not a single performance car in the entire Mercedes model line when this car appeared, with the legendary 300 SL having been replaced by the more touring-oriented Pagoda SL for 1964. And it did all of this without looking any different. No deep chin spoiler or driving lights, the exhaust tips weren't more numerous or any bigger, and even the steel wheels with color-coded hubcaps of the standard car appeared unchanged. What you got was 10mm wider tires and a 6.3 badge on the trunk lid. That's it. Even the car's launch was under the radar. The 6.3 was unveiled at the Geneva Motor Show in March of 1968 without so much as an advance announcement, which added even more to the shock of its arrival. The US launch occurred a few months later in June at the Laguna Seca Raceway in California, of all damn places. Rudy Uhlenhaut was there, famously able to come within a few tenths of legendary racer Juan Manuel Fangio on track, and he proceeded to give terrified journalists first-hand evidence of what the 6.3 could do at speed. Even today, the idea of introducing a fast S-Class at Laguna seems comedic, but back then, it was incomprehensible. But it ended up being sort of appropriate because in 1969, Vauxenberger took the car racing. At the time, racing was a sensitive subject at Mercedes. They had withdrawn from factory-backed racing after the horrific crash at Le Mans in 1955, in which one of their cars flew into the crowd and exploded, killing 84 people. As a result, it was against company policy for Daimler-Benz employees to race, and so Waxenberger did what any sensible gearhead would: skirted the rules by finding a race that was so far away that the mothership wouldn't notice or care. And that's how the 6.3 made its competition debut at Macau. 5 cars were sent over, and Uhlenhaut covered for Waxenberger, explaining to management that the cars were being demonstrated to a group of wealthy Hong Kong businessmen, omitting that the demonstration was in fact a 6-hour endurance race on the streets of Macau. Waxenberger qualified his car on pole position and went on to win the race, beating a Porsche 911S in the process. In third place was another 6.3. Headquarters were upset when they found out what had happened, but not upset enough to deny Waxenberger the customary 10,000 Deutschmark prize for any private driver who won a race or rally in a Mercedes-Benz. With this success under their belt, Mercedes allowed Waxenberger to prepare some cars to race in Europe that summer, with an eye on the 24-hour touring car race at Spa-Francorchamps. Even stripped for racing, the 6.3 weighed a porky 3,500 pounds, yet it was capable of a G of lateral acceleration, which made the car incredibly hard on tires. As the race approached in July, it was clear that the heat would be too much for the tires to hold together. In testing, chunks of tire flew off, and Mercedes wouldn't allow Waxenberger to flare the wheel arches to fit wider tires. The cars were withdrawn to permit more time to prepare them, and then the rules were changed in a way that would require substantial re-engineering to meet, and Mercedes did not have, or perhaps would not provide, the engineering resources to do this work. But somebody else had the resources, and that was a pair of former Mercedes employees who had started a company called AMG in 1967. They tuned cars for private owners and set to work preparing a 6.3 to race for the 1971 season. Their car used a 6.8-liter engine and debuted at Hockenheim on the 4th of July and was promptly crashed, and rather badly. The 24-hour race at Spa was less than 3 weeks away, and the team picked up the pieces and worked overtime, together with free labor from a group of university students, to reconstitute the car. Saddled with heavy brake, tire, and fuel consumption, the car nonetheless achieved 5th fastest time in qualifying out of 60 cars, and it was lying 3rd by the end of the first lap of the race. Thanks to the long straights, which allowed the big red Mercedes to exercise its massive speed, and critically, the brakes to cool, the car was genuinely competitive and dead reliable too. Shockingly, at the end of the race, only one car was ahead of it, resulting in what has become a legendary achievement: 2nd place for a Mercedes-Benz S-Class in a 24-hour endurance race against a field of purpose-built race cars. As if this result wasn't improbable enough, the car, often known as the Red Pig, achieved this with power steering, air suspension, full carpeting, and even walnut veneer on the dashboard and door panels. This extraordinary achievement, perhaps more than any other, sums up the 6.3. Trying to explain what made the 6.3 they tested in 1968 so special, Road and Track simply said that whatever it is asked to do, it does better than almost any other car. That was true in 1968, but how about today? The short answer is that it's still very impressive. Because of all this competence and engineering, the car feels much newer than it is when it's on the move. The centerpiece of the driving experience is of course the engine. It's smooth and refined compared to an American V8 of the same era, although when you dip into the throttle, or heaven forbid stand on it, the car surges or explodes forward in a way that is downright brutal. This impression is enhanced by the transmission, which shifts in a way that's so firm that it made me laugh the first time I experienced it. It feels solid and well made. It also feels like getting rear-ended by a freight train. By default, the car starts in 2nd gear, which dulls the off-the-line acceleration, but if you command a downshift to 1st with either swift throttle application or the gear lever, the car will wallop you with noise and torque, chirp the tires into 2nd, and again into 3rd. The absurdity of doing this in such a dignified, well-made, and classically styled sedan is addictive and hilarious. When this car was built, Mercedes habitually shunned excess. They were not inclined towards frivolity or drama, making it the last place you'd expect a bonkers super sedan to be invented. The 6.3 is your well-mannered uncle at a wedding who says and does all the right age-appropriate things until the very end of the reception, when he's shutting down the dance floor with all the kids and somehow knows all the lyrics to My Neck, My Back, and is belting them out at the top of his lungs. And he does it completely sober. The aspects of the driving experience that most dated are primarily aesthetic. The interior feels positively Baroque by modern standards. The visibility is outstanding with a low beltline and slim pillars. The large, thin-rimmed steering wheel reinforces this vintage impression as well, and it sets the expectation that the steering will be vague and the ratio slow, but the opposite is true. With 3 turns lock to lock, it's a fast ratio for a car of this era, although the large steering wheel still means that your hands and arms are moving quite a bit. But it's a rock-solid platform. You can take your hands off the wheel at high speeds, and the car is as stable and planted as any contemporary German car. Hustling the car on technical roads reveals another surprise. Despite having air suspension, the chassis is neither floaty nor vague. In fact, it's pleasantly firm and well-controlled, and dare I say it, poised. Rather than feeling like a mass of unruly parts being shepherded down the road in the same approximate direction, the 6.3 is a cohesive whole that's easy to control and even playful, especially if the driver's willing to use the throttle. The limits aren't particularly high, but the car's behavior near them is so much closer to a sports car than I was expecting. The 6.3 is legendary for its straight-line performance, but no one ever talks about how enjoyable the chassis is, and it was this characteristic that surprised me the most about the car. It's also the perfect embodiment of what makes this car so extraordinary. It's incredibly complete and well-rendered. Because the 6.3 did such a good job of defining the model for the high-performance sedan, it doesn't feel that foreign today. And that perhaps is the highest compliment you can pay it. The concept and execution still feel so contemporary, even though the car is more than 50 years old. In period, however, it was pure madness, as though the old men at Daimler-Benz had finally lost their marbles. But what they created was hugely compelling, so much so that Car and Driver declared it to be the most desirable four-door sedan to appear since the Model J Duesenberg. High praise, to be sure, but what it highlights is that the 6.3 was so far away from any other car around it that the journalists evaluating it had to look decades into the past in order to find something that even approached its magic. As if to prove this, 5 decades on, cars like this are everywhere now, and we owe them all to the 6.3.